Hello, Pulp Hounds. How are we doing today? I'm doing really well today because I had a wonderful surprise. We are going to get to the book birth year thing in a minute, but I had a wonderful surprise this morning. Absolutely brilliant. The Hermes delivery chap knocked on my door. He was greeted by me in my Pac-Man pyjamas, genuinely, and handed me a parcel, which I wasn't expecting, and it contained some wonderful issues of Occult Detective Magazine, actual paper ones. Now, as you can see, it's called Occult Detective Magazine, but it's much more of a book than a magazine. And I've read a lot of the PDFs. There's issue 6, issue 7, and issue 8, which is the newest one. I've read a lot of the PDFs of Occult Detective Magazine, but just to have them as paper copies, they are gorgeous. It just makes such a huge difference. They're just wonderful. It's something I will continue to collect, I must admit. And I have to say a huge thanks, and I've got to get this right because I always get his name wrong, the pronunciation. I'm going with Brzeski. Dave Brzeski. Oh God, if I get it wrong, I am so in for it. He also included a copy of The Angry Dead. What a gorgeous name for a book, and what a brilliant cover. It's the ghost stories of Rosemary Pardo, who created a kind of ghost hunting detective called Jane Bradshaw. A lot of these were originally written in the 80s. It's been something I've wanted to read for a while, ever since Dave was saying, do you know what, this has been our best-selling book. And I just thought, Dave, I'll send you a copy. I thought he was going to send me a PDF. He actually sent me the book. Thank you so much, mate. I genuinely appreciate it, and it's totally made my morning. I'll be starting reading this today, and I will do a full breakdown of this gorgeous looking book. So, the birth year booktube thing, it's been doing the rounds, and I think it's really cool. I've been really enjoying watching everybody's different takes on stuff. So there's 5 questions which you have to answer about books and such. I spotted it. The one I saw first was on Darryl Sloan's YouTube channel. Check Darryl out. I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the description, or it might just be linked to one of his videos, and then you can find his channel from there. I'm not quite sure how linking works all the time. He's got a great channel where he discusses interesting books, all sorts of aspects of reading. He did one recently about how good it is to have a Kindle and read electronic books, which I found really interesting, if a little triggering, because as you can see from my living room, I like actual books. He does a lot on philosophy, which is a little bit over my head. I tend to gravitate towards somber fabrics and dark fiction. Philosophy's out of my remit, so some of it I get. Some of it I'm a bit like, whoa, I don't get that at all. But one thing he does that's just awesome, and I love them, he does kind of 8-bit recreations of 80s synthy film themes, and they are wonderful. The John Carpenter ones just work so brilliantly well. So check those out. Anyway, on to the first question. Question 1. Have you read any books published in the year you were born? If so, what's your favourite and why? Do you have any other favourites? If you haven't read any birth year books, which one do you pledge to read in the next 6 months and why? So I've kind of got to figure out if I've read any horror books. I was born in 1975. Well, I say born, I finished my larval stage and evolved into this fine specimen you see today. Yeah, imagine me trying to work out if I've read any books from the 70s. I'm spoilt for choice, genuinely. I've made notes and I don't forget anything. There were so many like key and important books in my personal library published in 1975. There's a brilliant anthology called The Satyr's Head by David Sutton. Robert Aikman's Cold Hand in Mine, that came out in 1975. There was The Cross of Frankenstein, the Robert Myers book. There was only 2 in that series, but I have loved those for a long time. It was like a fine vintage year for New English Library as well. So we got Martin Jensen's The Odour of Decay, which, oh, it's so good. Ian Dear's Village of Blood, which is like the making of a Hammer film, but it's a Hammer film. Oh, that's just wonderful. We got the last couple of Errol LaCarle specialist novels. Guyan Smith kicked things off for me with The Slime Beast and The Sucking Pit, 2 bonkers favourites. There was Lesson for the Damned by Brian Ball, another favourite that I've owned for years. I remember getting it when New English Library books were like pence, 50 pence from markets. Ron Goulart started his Vampirella novels series. We only got 3 of them in this country, or I've only ever found 3. There might have been more, I can't remember. But that was another. I love Vampirella, I love Warren comics, and I do collect the old 60s and 70s Vampirella comics. And just to have novelizations of those, it was a strange thing. I've been kicking around doing a video about those for a while, but it's like a straight novelization of the comics, which is very odd, and I've never really come across any other novel, just straight novelizations of comics, not where there's been a movie involved or anything like that. Brian Lumley was continuing his Titus Crow series with the transition of Titus Crow, the follow-up to Burrows Beneath, which are absolute kind of Cthulhu favourites of mine. What else we got? Oh yeah, there was a collection of Frank Belknap long stories called The Early Long, which collects a lot of his Lovecraft-inspired stuff. I really love all that. I'm not as much into the sci-fi that he branched into, that kind of 50s heavy sci-fi novel. It's not really my cup of tea, but his early stuff is just wonderful. And I remember the first time I read The Hounds of Tyndalos, and I was like, heck, this is like, it genuinely unnerved me. And it's kind of like, this brilliant that a story from decades ago can unnerve me now. So The Early Long is one of my favourite weird fiction collections. But I think my favourite book from 1975 is Ron Chetwin Hayes' The Monster Club. I love The Monster Club. And I was aware of the movie before I read the book. And this is the original. I think the book, the movie came out in, was it 1981 or 1980? So there was a film tie-in, which I don't like quite as much as the beautiful New English Library original edition. I just love The Monster Club. I get it. Right. I love The Monster Club. I'm aware of its failings. As a movie, it's quite poor in parts. It's so poor, it's charming in a ridiculous way. And because I saw the movie before I read the book, reading the book just reminds me of the movie. If you've not seen The Monster Club or read the book, it's about a writer who helps a chap. He doesn't realise he's a vampire, and he invites him to the Monster Club, which is a nightclub where all the ghouls and beasties and monsters hang out and dance to pop music. Yeah, all right, B.A. Robertson is one of those pop performers, so that just brings it down like a touch in my estimation. Not a fan. But, like, there's the pretty things, and oh, it's so good. And they have a stripper, but she'd like takes her clothes off, but then takes her skin off, and she's a skeleton doing dancing. If for decades I've just wanted to go to the Monster Club, yeah, I'd have to have a glass of tomato juice just to blend in. But I'd go in all my Victorian finery like Jack the Ripper, and I'd dance with all the skeleton ladies and have a wonderful time. So yeah, I have read books published in my birth year, and my favourite has to be The Monster Club. Question 2. Have you read any books published in the year you turned 18? If so, what's your favourite and why? Well, yes, I have. Oddly enough. When I was 18, I was more about looking backwards. I was more into the 30s and 40s pulp type stuff. That whole era of weird fiction. And I wasn't really keeping a close eye on what was coming out. And some of these I've read since I turned 18. But these all came out in 1993. And again, I'm kind of spoilt for choice for some of them. There was Stephen Jones's anthology, Lovecraft's Book of Horror, which took supernatural horror in literature and used that as a basis for an anthology, finding some fairly obscure things that Lovecraft refers to in that essay. And it was illustrated by Dave Carson, who I aspired to be like for years before I realised it was okay to find my own illustrative style. But yeah, Dave Carson's Lovecraft work was just beautiful. So that whole package, an anthology based on supernatural horror in literature, illustrated by Dave Carson. It was, I think, my favourite book of the year. No, not my favourite book of the year. It was one of my favourite books of the year. We also, 1993, Ramsey Campbell's Long Lost and the brilliant Alone with the Horrors came out. That's an awesome anthology, if you like Ramsey. I know he's a bit marmitey. A lot of people don't seem to like his stuff. It's kind of like if you get it, if it triggers something in your head, he's just brilliant. But he does seem to leave some people cold, and I can't quite fathom why exactly. Brian Lumley brought out Fruit in Bodies, which is a brilliant collection of horror stories. I think that's the short story format for Brian Lumley. I think he just was brilliant with it. I love his novels, but some of his short stories are just bleak and unsettling and horrible in a brilliant way. But I think my favourite book from 1993 is The Immaculate by Mark Morris. And I'm a little bit biased because Mark's a wonderful chap. But The Immaculate's ace. It's like half ghost story and half a story about confronting a whole assortment of childhood fears that you manage to escape and put behind you. It's about Jack Stone. Following the death of his abusive father, he returns back home to, get things sorted. And that's when all these things come back. And it's half ghost story. And I don't know, there's a lot about people that bullied Jack when they were younger, but they've never moved away, and it's like they're genuinely horrible. But they're I don't know how to explain it. It's really interesting because they've kind of stayed in this village, but Jack Stone's moved away and spread his wings and found new things in life, whereas the bullies are still still there. They've never moved away. They've never done anything different. And it almost feels like you should pity them a bit. I mean, everybody makes their own decisions about life and where they want to live and what they want to do. But they're just exactly the same person in the same place as they were when they were kids. But it's impossible to pity the bullies because of how brilliantly Mark Morris writes these antagonists. I think anybody that's faced bullying at any point in their life will identify with the... I genuinely felt that prickle of like, oh hell, this is going to kick off. This is going to go. What do I do? That rising panic. Brilliant book. And like all Mark's books, it's like subtle and quite punchy and kind of gently eerie, but also quite visceral and violent in parts. It's a well constructed, like all Mark's books, it's a well constructed British, very British feeling horror story. So yeah, 1993, The Immaculate by Mark Morris. Question 3. Of the last 10 books you read, how many were published before you were born? What were they? Did you prefer them to the newer books? I think the last 10 books I read were all published after I was born. But I read a lot for my channel, so there's a couple of videos I'm wanting to do and I'm rereading an author's kind of back catalogue. I'm also writing some stuff for Occult Detective Magazine, so I'm reading a series of books to be able to talk about that. That were all published after I was born. Obviously, I love a lot of stuff that was published long before I was born. Lovecraft, William Hope Hodgson, Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James. There's so many authors that I go back to time and time again that I love reading. It just depends how I'm feeling, and I think there's a lot of enjoyment to be had in a lot of older fiction published before I was born, and there's a lot of enjoyment to be had in new fiction. I mean, you've seen in some of my videos, I got books for Christmas. I bought myself books for Christmas with vouchers and things, and that's all newer stuff. So as that's been arriving, I've been sat delving into it. So normally it's a mix of older and newer. At the minute, you've just caught me on a day where I think the past 10 books I read are all fairly new. But that's just because they all arrived at and for and after Christmas. Question 4. What's your favourite movie from your birth year and why? Again, I'm spoilt for choice. Like 1975, so many of my favourites. Crispino's Autopsy, Dario Argento's Profondo Rosso, that's an absolute favourite. Umberto Lenzi's weird, like half giallo, half Agatha Christie eyeball. Pete Walker's House of Mortal Sin. I love Pete Walker's films. They're just perfectly British 70s sleaze. Dan Curtis's Trilogy of Terror, that came out in 1975, and that little tribal doll with its teeth, and oh, that's been one of my favourite horror moments for so many years. But I think my favourite from 1975 it's a little bit left field, and it's like the end of a series, and it's Armando de Osorio's Night of the Seagulls. I just adore The Blind Dead. Like, for so many years, I looked at pictures in, was it Alan Frank's book of horror movies, and I think it was in a Dennis Gifford book of horror movies. There were just these stills from the Blind Dead series. If you haven't seen them, it's well, they've got different origin stories in all the movies, but it's an evil Knights Templar, and they're from way back when, and they're killed by angry villagers. And to stop them finding their way back from hell, their eyes are gouged out. But they do come back from hell, obviously, which is gleefully wonderful, and they're blind dead. So you can walk past them as long as you're silent. So they move quite slowly. They're very desiccated with hoods and robes, and they're all rotten and stinky and very, very desiccated and dry. But you can kind of navigate past them. They want to kill you, obviously. They just want to stab you the heck up. But you can get past them and escape if you make no noise at all. And I just think that, like, there's certain bits in some of the films, they're a bit everything. They're a bit sleazy, they're a bit daft, they're a bit gory, but the whole idea and look of the blind dead I still find chilling, and I'm sure it goes back to seeing those photos in books about horror movies when I was a lot younger. And I was just desperate to see these films, so desperate to see these films. And when I used to, I've mentioned in videos before, I used to buy copied VHS tapes off Leeds Market in the 90s. And I managed to get, like, the Blind Dead films, and they didn't disappoint. And thankfully Anchor Bay have done a gorgeous box set with a lovely little booklet, and they're just wonderful films. Don't watch them on YouTube, because a lot of the ones on YouTube are like weirdly cut. Just track down the Anchor Bay ones if you want to watch it. So favourite horror film from 1975, Night of the Seagulls. And question 5 is, what is your favourite horror movie from the year you turned 18? So back to 1993. A lot of younger people I know have a lot of nostalgia for the 90s. But a lot of the 90s I spent hunting round second-hand record shops, buying like punk and goth from way back when. So it was kind of a bit of an odd time for me, but there were some films that have stayed with me that I think are still favourites. 1993 was a good year for anthology movies for the portmanteau, because we got John Carpenter's Body Bags. How gleeful was John Carpenter as the kind of Crypt Keeper type horror host in that? And Brian Yuzna's Necronomicon, which was a Lovecraft portmanteau movie. Brian Yuzna was, and still is, such a brilliant director. At the time in the 90s, I found him really groundbreaking. George Romero brought us The Dark Half, which was another favourite. Dario Argento, sticking with the Neo Giallo thing with Trauma. That was another great one, just to be young and enjoying cinema, and Argento coming up with new and interesting films. I know he gets a lot of stick for his later stuff, but I really like it. And then, who can forget, 1993 brought us Warwick Davis and Jennifer Aniston in Leprechaun.
Fuck you, Lucky Charms.
Can't you tell by the buckles on my shoes I'm a leprechaun? What a brilliant film. What a strange film. What an unusual film that probably wouldn't be made today. But at the time, it was great. But for my favourite film from 1993, I'm torn. I've got it down to 2. And they're so very different, I can't pick a favourite out of the 2. So I'm having to put 2 in there. And that's, again, Brian Yuzna, Return of the Living Dead Part 3, and Jorg Buttgereit's Schramm. Return of the Living Dead 3, like, I love Return of the Living Dead. It was punk rock, zombies, Linnea Quigley, like, having fantasies about being eaten alive by a load of old men, which got a bit weird, but hey. And, like, Return of the Living Dead 2, I felt a little bit let down, because I wanted that punk rock, rock and roll, comedy, zombie, brain-munching hilarity. And it kind of wasn't. It was kind of Return of the Living Dead again, but just not as good. So when Return of the Living Dead 3 came out, I was a bit like, okay, well, 2 was a bit naff. So I went in with no expectations, and it was something totally new for what had already become a pretty tired zombie genre. And it just blew me away just because it was violent and shocking and romantic and intelligent and like just totally left field and totally brilliant. And then on the opposite side of horror, we've got Shram. I'm a big fan of Jorg Butgereit. Sorry, it's Jorg, isn't it? I think. I only ever saw his name written down for years, so I'll kind of pronounce it Jorg, but I think it's Jorg. I can't remember. But, like, again, going back to when I used to buy copies of tapes off Leeds Market, like, the first film I ever saw of his was Der Todesking, which I found thoroughly shocking and upsetting and dark, and it finished and I was kind of sat quietly in my attic room just thinking, what did I just watch? What was that? And then obviously there's the necromantic films, which are a difficult watch, but I like being challenged in an intelligent way. So I was really eager to see Shram, which is one of his films about a serial killer. And again, it's kind of sensitive and delicate. And as I said, I think in a video I talked about the box set that had come out, his films don't feel like aggressive horror films. There's a subtleness and a gentleness to it all. But they're bleak and horrible. So, 2 favourite films from 1993, Return of the Living Dead Part 3 and Shram. Both very different, both very grisly, and both really had a big impact on me at the time. And that's it, I'll stop waffling now. I enjoyed doing that, and if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you lovely folks in the next video.